This video is sort of a supplement to our study of the Gospel of John. It had been requested that we study the topic of who was the disciple whom Jesus loved. How can we figure out the identity of this person? And so I'm very happy to provide this lesson, and I hope it helps you as you think more about the Gospel of John. This mysterious disciple appears 5 times in the narrative. The first time we are told about him is at the Last Supper. We are told here in John 13:23, there was reclining on Jesus' bosom or chest one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. And so he is there at the Last Supper. He appears again in chapter 19 at the cross. You remember that we're told here that Jesus' mother is there, and when he saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, that he gave his mother into the care of this disciple. This disciple comes on the scene again in chapter 20. Remember, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and found it empty. She ran and came to Simon Peter and the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them what she had seen, and they got up and ran to the tomb. The next time we hear about this disciple is in chapter 21 and verse 7. Remember that Jesus had told the disciples to put their net in the water. They didn't recognize that it was Jesus yet, and when they caught the great number of fish, it says that the disciple whom Jesus loved figured out that it was Jesus and said to Peter, "Hey, it's the Lord." The last time we hear about him is in chapter 20 and verses 20 and following, where Jesus and Peter are walking together and talking. Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. So these are the 5 places where this disciple appears. The question is, if we correlate from what we know from the other Gospels with the Gospel of John and make some reasons between the evidence, can we come up with the identity of this disciple? We're going to start with what I simply call the classic argument or the traditional argument to identify who this disciple is. The classic argument begins like this, that whoever this mystery disciple was, he must have been one of the 12, because the first time we find him there in John 13, he's at the Last Supper. And so Jesus, of course, is eating the Last Supper with the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, so this man must be one of them. This is a chart showing the list of the 12 as it is recorded in the Bible. You'll notice we have a list in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. The 4th gospel never gives us a list of the 12. Now, it does mention the 12 as a term, as a group, but it never tells us who those 12 men are. And this goes along with what we've suggested before as we studied the gospel, that the 4th gospel seems to assume that you already know the basic story of Jesus. So he doesn't bother to give us the list of the 12. So Peter's always listed first, Judas is always listed last. We've got some variation in between there. You'll notice that the basic difference is that Matthew and Mark have a Thaddeus, and Luke and Acts has a Jude, so they are presumably the same person, but otherwise everybody is accounted for. So the assumption is that somebody on this list is our mystery disciple. The argument goes on to say that whoever this mystery disciple was, the chances are pretty good that he is one of a group that scholars have come to call the inner circle of the apostles. That inner circle would be Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And the reason they are called an inner circle is because there are some scenes in the Gospels where Jesus takes these men aside and either shows them something or says something to them that is not shared with the other 8 apostles. The Transfiguration, for example, is one of those scenes. The reason that it is believed that the mystery disciple is likely one of the inner circle is because this mystery disciple is sitting right next to Jesus at the Last Supper and leans back on Jesus' chest. In the drawing you see here, this shows the kind of eating arrangement that would have been used at the Last Supper. It's what the Bible calls reclining at table. And so you'll notice that these people are lying on their left side, eating with their right hand. And you'll notice this first couple here, that if this character here wanted to speak to this second person, he could very easily just lean back, putting his head in that person's chest and speaking to them that way. And that seems to be exactly what is going on in John 13 as we read the story there, that there was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples. That's probably not people sitting in chairs and somebody leaning over on Jesus. That seems like that would have been awkward. But this would be easily accounted for if Jesus was in one of the seats like here, and the disciple whom Jesus loved is to Jesus' right. You'll also notice here, keep this in mind, in verse 24 in the text, Simon Peter gestured to him and said, "Tell us who Jesus is talking about." Apparently, Peter is not sitting on the other side of Jesus. He is sitting somewhere across from the disciple that is sitting on the right hand of Jesus. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the argument is that since there was this kind of special group of insiders that Jesus shared special things with, it is likely that one of those men would have been sitting this close to Jesus at the Last Supper, and that therefore this mystery disciple is one of those 4 inner apostles of Peter, Andrew, James, or John. Now, we know that this mystery disciple cannot be Peter, because in the 4th gospel, this mystery disciple is mentioned 5 times, and in 4 of those scenes, Peter is with him. So Peter cannot be the same person as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And if we look at the book of Acts and ask who is the normal companion of the apostle Peter outside of the Gospels, the answer is John. And so this is the first part of the argument that says it is likely that the apostle John is the disciple whom Jesus loved. It's not Peter, and it is somebody associated with Peter. But couldn't it be Andrew? What would rule out Andrew? Well, the traditional argument says that, well, Andrew is mentioned by name in the 4th gospel in some texts. And it doesn't seem likely that the author would sometimes call him Andrew and then sometimes refer to him kind of anonymously. That if we know who this is, just mention him by name. And so based on that kind of reasoning, the argument goes that it's not likely that Andrew is the apostle or the disciple whom Jesus loved. So it's not Peter, it's not likely to be Andrew, it could be either John or James. James, however, dies very early in the story. Remember, he is killed in Acts chapter 12, long before any of the Gospels were written. But obviously, well, not obviously, but there is this strong presumption that the author of the 4th Gospel may indeed be this same disciple whom Jesus loved, and so he couldn't have died early in the history of Christianity, and that would rule out James. So based on these kinds of reasonings and kind of a process of elimination that comes from them, The classic argument says that of the four most likely apostles to be the disciple whom Jesus loved, John would be the most likely of all of them. There is another kind of branch to this argument based on the fact that it certainly seems like the author of the fourth gospel may be the disciple whom Jesus loved. In several episodes, it seems that the author is describing the scene through the eyes of the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's probably the clearest back here in John chapter 13, where this whole story seems to be written as if the author and the disciple whom Jesus loved are the same person. Well, there's a Christian who lived in the 2nd century. His name is Irenaeus, and he says that he knew a man named Polycarp. Polycarp, he tells us, was an older man than himself. So get the picture. We have Irenaeus, who is a young man, Polycarp, who is a generation older than Irenaeus. And Irenaeus tells us Polycarp knew the Apostle John. So we have this kind of chain of evidence, as it were, that John knew Polycarp, Polycarp knew Irenaeus. That going from John forward to Irenaeus, we have this unbroken link of personal acquaintances. Now, according to Irenaeus, this older gentleman, Polycarp, identified the author of the fourth gospel as the Apostle John. And as we noted, there is this strong sense that the gospel author seems to be the same person as this mysterious disciple. So, for example, in John 13:28, the narrative at the Last Supper, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. Well, of course, we know from the narrative that the disciple whom Jesus loved knew who it was because he had just spoken to Jesus and Jesus told him what sign to watch for. So the narrative seems to be written from this point of view, that the narrator is saying nobody else in the room except the disciple whom Jesus loved knew this, and therefore there is this presumption that the disciple whom Jesus loved and the narrator are the same person. So that is kind of the traditional classic argument that through a process of reasoning and elimination, the mystery disciple turns out to be the Apostle John, one of the sons of Zebedee. However, I think it's only fair to point out that there are some problems with this traditional explanation. First of all, the traditional argument, as we have rehearsed it here, assumes that only the 12 ate the Last Supper with Jesus, that it was only Jesus and these 12 men in the room at the time of the Last Supper. Now that could well be true, and if it is true, then the disciple whom Jesus loved must have been one of the apostles. But is it possible that there were a few other disciples who ate the Last Supper with Jesus, and that these disciples were witnesses of that scene and recorded what they saw? In John chapter 21, we have some apostles mentioned, but Nathanael is also mentioned, who is not an apostle, as being on that scene there. We know from the other Gospels that it is highly likely, if not downright certain, that there was always more than just the 12 apostles around Jesus at any given moment in his life, that there were other disciples who followed Jesus just as much as the 12. So is it possible that there were more people in the room than just the 12 when Jesus ate the Last Supper? Yes. So it is also possible that one of those disciples could have been the disciple whom Jesus loved. Also, the traditional argument assumes that the mystery disciple is always anonymous, that he simply cannot be the same person as another named disciple. But this is an assumption, and there's really no reason why the author of the fourth gospel could not have referred to the same person sometimes by name and sometimes by this other description. He may have had really good reasons for sometimes referring to a particular apostle as the apostle whom Jesus loved, and at other times not mentioning that description of him. It is certainly possible. And so it is possible that the disciple whom Jesus loved could be one of the other apostles as well. And concerning this idea that the author of the fourth gospel and the mystery disciple are the same person, we have to consider that it is possible that in the scenes where he is mentioned, the mystery disciple is not the author of the narrative. In other words, the traditional explanation says that the author of the narrative is talking about himself when he mentions the disciple whom Jesus loved. But it is possible that the author is a different person altogether. To use one person's explanation, it is possible that the author of the gospel is the person taking the photograph, as it were. Think of it this way. If you have a photograph with 4 people in it, how many people were at the scene? Well, unless you use the self-timer on a tripod with your camera, the answer is there were 5 people at the scene. One person taking the photograph who is not in the picture. And so some scholars have suggested that the author need not necessarily be the disciple whom Jesus loved. You look back here in chapter 13. It is quite possible that when the text says that there was leaning on Jesus' bosom a disciple whom Jesus loved, that is not the same person who is telling the story. And so if the disciple, the mystery disciple, and the author are not the same person, then these arguments that connect the two may not be correct. So who is the disciple that Jesus loved? Well, we know it's not Peter, and we can rule Judas out as well. I would suggest also that it is not likely that it is Thomas, because of what we read about in chapter 20, that Peter and the mystery disciple go to the tomb and see it empty for themselves. And it is Thomas who is not with the disciples and who won't believe the reports. The whole thrust of that narrative strongly seems to suggest that Thomas is not the man who went to the tomb with Peter, but the mystery disciple is somebody other than Thomas. So could this mystery disciple be the Apostle John? Yes, it could be the Apostle John. However, we have to reckon with the idea that it could be any disciple, any apostle, other than Peter, Thomas, and Judas. In other words, it doesn't just have to be John. So if we go back to our list here, we know it's not Peter, we know it's not Judas, and probably not Thomas. So there are 3 out of the 12 that we can scratch off the list. but it could well be any of these other 9. There's really nothing that would rule out any of the other 9 men. Again, the assumption in the traditional argument is usually that it must have been one of the inner circle of Jesus' apostles who was sitting so close to Jesus at the Last Supper, but that is simply an assumption. It could have been another disciple, not one of the 12, who was in that place. Some have suggested, well, maybe we can narrow it down a little further. In John chapter 21, we have here a list of people who are at that scene in verse 2. We have Peter and Thomas, Nathanael, who's not one of the 12, the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, and 2 other disciples. So there are 7 people, 6 of whom presumably are apostles. These 2 other of his disciples are presumably apostles, presumably part of the 12, although maybe not. So if we put in boldface the names of the men who are listed here, we have Peter, the sons of Zebedee, and Thomas that are mentioned for sure. Our mystery disciple could be any of these other people in this list whose names are not boldface. So that would be 7 other possibilities. Judas is out of the scene by this time. So the apostle or the disciple whom Jesus loved could have been Andrew or Philip. It could have been Bartholomew, Matthew, James, Alphaeus, son of Alphaeus, Simon or Jude. It could have been John, but if the author of the story is a separate person from the people mentioned here, then it could have not been John and one of these other people. We'll finish with one more possibility, and that is that the mystery disciple could have been one of Jesus' brothers. If we go back to the narrative in John chapter 19, where we find this mystery disciple at the cross of Jesus, think about the possibilities that this could be one of Jesus' brothers. Now, we're told earlier in the Gospel of John that Jesus' brothers did not believe in him in around chapter 6 or 7 when Jesus went to the feast. But is it possible that at least one of his brothers came to be a believer in Jesus by the time of the Last Supper? Yes, that is possible. Then, if that is true, notice how this text then reads, that Jesus sees his mother, he sees this disciple and says, "Woman, behold your son." What if those words are more literal than we usually take them to be? What if Jesus is speaking to one of his brothers and says, "It's time for you to take care of mom from now on"? Is it possible that if one of Jesus' brothers became a believer while Jesus was still alive, that this brother could have been at the Last Supper? Yes, that is possible. And so some scholars have suggested that maybe this mystery disciple is not one of the 12, but maybe he is one of Jesus' brothers. We have to entertain that it could be a possibility. So where does all of this leave us? Well, I do think that the traditional argument is weighty, that there is this strong push of evidence that seems to go down the trajectory that leads to the identification of John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. There is a strong sense that that is the case. However, we have to be honest and we have to recognize that the evidence that we have is not absolute, it's not airtight, it is not conclusive, and it is possible to make sense of all of these references by understanding that this mystery disciple is somebody else. I know that we haven't come to a solid, definite answer, but that's the nature of the situation that we have inherited. I hope that you'll continue to think about these things and think about them as you think back on our study of the Gospel of John.